Now, I know everyone's stinging for a beer, but we have one last event. It's a panel, and we will be discussing hop selection. So on this panel, we've got two people sitting with me. We've got Bob Kunz. Are you here, Bob? Yeah, let me talk to you. Bob has been having fun with beer since 2001. He opened Highland Park Brewery in Los Angeles in 2014. With the team at Highland Park, Bob has taken an adventurous approach to building a thoughtful community and exploring beer. With innovation and drinking beer in the LA sunshine in mind, the team at the Highland Park experiments with unique processes, lots of hops, local ingredients, and of course, making lager beer, really actually delicious lager beer, I have to say. We're not crushing a West Coast Pils at Highland Park. Bob digs into finer details of gardening, fermentation, and optimizing sleep. That's just adorable. All right, I also would really love to welcome to the stage Scotty Hargrave. Scotty's been has been brewing professionally since 2008. He began at Sunshine Coast Brewing, then spent 4 years at Stone and Wood, followed by 18 months as the head brewer at Byron Bay Brewing, before planning and building the Balter Brewery in March 2016. Scott's multiple gold medal winning XPA scored first in both the 2017-2018 Hottest 100 Craft Beers poll and has remained on the podium in each successive year. A multiple AIBA trophy winner, an internationally recognized beer judge, Scott describes his brewing success as good fortune so far as not bad for a concreter. I love it.
Give me the mic.
All right. Welcome, gentlemen. I think you're the perfect pair to be sitting here and talking about selection with. Scotty, obviously the awesome success, rightly so, of XPA has given you and Balter like hop purchasing powers that have opened doors that many brewers can only dream of. And Bob, your brewery in LA is relatively small, and your requirements don't automatically buy you a place at the selection table. However, your beers are exceptional, and I know that you take a very thoughtful and sometimes creative approach to sourcing your hops. So we have people at both ends of the craft beer spectrum. Now, I'd want to start this off. I'm just actually going to throw out the counter case to selection. So I've had many people throw this at me, and it still informs hops in a number of countries. This idea that if we're going to have like a hop variety, then it is better for all of the hops to be picked, all of the hops to be homogenized, and for us just to get one single brand. How do you guys feel about that?
Hey, everyone. Well, I don't know, Pete. I don't think you and I necessarily perceive beer exactly the same. I don't think we see the world exactly the same. My blue is different to your blue. My favourite song is different to your song. I think that hop selection is particularly for me, is a very, very individual pursuit. I think that's how we have in part such a huge range of diversity in beer styles, but also in diversity within beer styles. That's how you get such that beautiful vast array, the huge magical colour range of what IPA looks like, what pale ale looks like, what hazy looks like, and if everybody had the exact same input, yeah, sure, things are going to be different, but I think it lessens your ability to express yourself. I mean, we have, in the human genome, we've got something like 1,000 genes that are capable of perceiving aroma, but each of us only have about 300 of those turned on, and it's as individual as your thumbprint, right? So your preference for different flavours, aromas, colours, sounds, whatever, is what makes the world a richer place, I reckon, and particularly in beer.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I would fully agree with what Scotty just said. I think that the it seems like the trend for craft beer in America is there's more breweries than ever. And I think to differentiate yourself, it is curating the product that you're putting out for people. And it's really hard to curate if you don't have a vast array of things to select from to make that product. So for me, that's been at the forefront of my sort of like journey of craft beer, is like getting closer access to the raw materials so that we can truly curate what goes into the glass. Because I think it's pretty hard to do that if everybody has the exact same thing. And I think, just thinking about, I put gardening on there because I really love like the agricultural side of things. I'm not anyways, I think that the recognizing that all these ingredients are agricultural products and that they really have value added by curation and selection, I think sort of is the story I both want to like live and tell through our brewery.
I mean, I'm just going to join in this one. I'm not just going to sit here and be impartial. I mean, my issue, the perfect example is Galaxy, isn't it? I mean, there's a hop where there is no selection allowed.
True that.
Give or take. And I mean, I question whether when you homogenize everybody's product, whether you're not rewarding those who are putting in the extra effort, are you? It's an interesting one. If you make shitty Galaxy, it's not like your Galaxy is left on the shelf at the end of the day and you realize that you need to pull your socks up. It's just getting blended in with everyone else's.
And I would make the argument not even that it's shitty, but it's purely that there's differences and that you may have a different preference because one person's shitty Galaxy is somebody else's favorite Galaxy. Yeah. So having that broad range of choices is what it's about to me, because absolutely there's things that I'm going to like and someone else isn't going to like.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
I think like the danger there is also that you bring everything to the middle. You can miss out on the peaks and troughs. And like Bob just said, my peak might be his trough, and vice versa. But that's probably a really efficient way to make sure that crop year all gets used up, because there's, I've seen it time and time again in selections where hops that are, for me, that are just onion and garlic and armpits and stuff is hugely enticing to some brewers, and I wouldn't be able to go near it. Whereas, my preference will be like, man, that's lame, and that just ties back to us being individuals and finding your own unique pathway through all this, which I think is really important too. It's a big part of how your identity comes through in your beer, the choices you make. I do all of the selections for Balter, and I do them alone. I'm happy to go in when I've been asked plenty of times to help other brewer friends select with them, but I'll kick everybody out of my rooms, because I want to live and die on the decisions that I make. And there's nothing like knowing that you could pick over 100 tons of shitty hops to sharpen your focus.
To distill your attention. Look, Scotty, I was going to start with you on this discussion. So, I've seen you in action in Yakima, and obviously I'm not blowing smoke up your ass when I say you're probably one of the most engaged, fastidious and exacting selectors that I've come across. That's obviously been a journey for you. I don't think people are born like that. Do you want to tell people about this journey from obviously, being a brewer who probably did just get a bag delivered because that's all you could get, to becoming what you are doing now?
Yeah, well, I was getting asked, in the first few years of my brewing career, I was in a brewery. My first brewing gig was on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, up past Brisbane. I was only there for a year before I joined Stone and Wood, and I basically inherited a bunch of hops from the previous brewer. And I was like, straight away, well, I wouldn't use that in that beer, and I wouldn't use that, and that's 3 years old. I don't want to use that. And I think it sowed that seed. At some point I want to have some control over this. moved to Stone and Wood. At one point, a few of you guys know this, that at one point I was probably throwing more Galaxy in more tanks than anybody else on the planet, right? So that was all about Galaxy, and the only real choice you had was whether it was Victorian or Tasmanian, if you can make that choice. Moved on to the Byron Bay Brewing Company, and again, inherited a bunch of hops in there. One of them happened to be like 10 boxes of Amarillo, and I played with Amarillo when I was a home brewer. Got into the stone fruit things, a bit like chili. Yep, love it for the first time. Put it on everything. 3 months later, you got chili on your cornflakes. Then eventually just reject it. You go, fuck, I've overdone this. And I was a bit like that with Amarillo, with the whole stone fruit thing, And for me, I often see hop aromas and flavours as colours, a bit of that Sensenese, whatever it's called. And, that was really pinky orangey as a colour to me, and I just got over it. And years later, I've gone to Byron Bay Brewing Company, grabbed this Amarillo, had to use it basically just because I didn't want to throw out, that many hops that somebody somewhere would have died to have them. So chucked them in a beer, and suddenly this beer was like beautifully yellow and tropical and stuff. And I'd realised that I'd probably moved from where I was, and so had the Amarillo a bit. I found out from Darren Gamash, who I met a few months later, and he was already on the gins by that time of the night, and I was pretty pissed. And I said to him, we got talking, I said, I got this Amarillo, and gee, it's yellow now. And me being an idiotic Australian, I didn't know that, Amarillo means yellow anyway, but he was pretty drunk too, and he's going, yeah, it is. It's really yellow. And then we spoke again after that when we were both sober, and he goes, no, tell me all about it. Like, send me the lots, and I'll tell you all about, what I can about the hop. And it turns out this was from Idaho, right? And by then they'd had to expand it. So I was like, wow, this is something else. This is really great. And for me, that was that first scratch into the surface where you can actually have an interaction with the guy who grew your hops, and they can tell you much more about it than you can just by ripping open a few foils and chucking them in and see what you get at the end. And it just sort of grew from there. So when we got Balter going, as soon as I was physically able to leave the brewery for a hop selection, that's sort of what I did. And I just got in there, and I was, I guess, intimidated to a point initially. I was like, there's a lot on the line here. What if I get it wrong? So I think that first year I sort of hedged my bets, and I was blending hops a bit just to get a sort of handle on it. And then very quickly I just went, no, I think I've got it, because I was seeing those hop characters that I really, really liked on the table were presenting themselves in the final beer. So I honed in on that, and pretty quickly I sort of thought, I'm on the journey, and I'm still a pup at this, but I think I can trust myself enough now to know that if I really like something on the table that is representative of what I want in the beer, and it's the right hop and the right combination, that we'll get there, I mean, you obviously, like you said, it's effort. You've got to put the effort in. As much as being on the table and smelling hops, it's having a beer with the guy who grew them. Showing up at that farm saying, your beer, I made this and your hops are in it, so I couldn't have made this without you. I mean, there's, I'm sure plenty of folks in here know who Jason Prold is, and every year when I end up over there at Jason's farm, I walk in there and see cans of our beer, and I kind of feel like that's it. I can stop now. Like that's a pretty important thing for me, and it's year on year it just continues.
Bob, what's your experience been at Highland Park?
I mean, I would, consider myself kind of still, it's like you do it once a year, and we've probably been doing it 5 years, so you sort of like have this short window to learn as much as you can. And every year it's kind of like, you take a little bit and you apply it to the next. So I mean, I would say my journey of like selecting has been one, it's funny because we're small, but we actually incorporate our whole team more in the selection process. And so a lot of that is like, as a team, we're, I would say, in a constant state of evaluating raw materials, like almost for like every batch of beer we make. We're thinking about the specific lots going into each beer and how we want that beer to be shaped. So we're collectively rubbing hops and creating a shared language about what we're looking for and what those hops are going to do in our beer. So it's been pretty interesting that we'll often, whether it is suppliers sending us hops and we're rubbing and selecting something, or we're at a table, we'll kind of blindly all select the same hop because, whether it's groupthink or whatever, we've all sort of like evolved together to like select the same, which is pretty interesting. So, yeah.
It can be nerve-wracking, obviously, and there's probably, I don't know, there might be quite a few people out in the audience today who haven't necessarily done a lot of selection. What kind of tips would you offer to people when you're starting this journey? Because it is a journey, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, for me, the biggest one, and I've said this to folks a few times, and I've been in selection rooms just with friends and helping out over the years with different brewers who've gotten really, really nervous about it, where they've said, can you come and do this with me? And that's fine, but it's like, oh, what if I get it wrong? What if I bugger this up? What am I, and I think you can let that crush you. But what I normally say to folks is, think about all the decisions that you've already made to get to this point where you're at a table and you're selecting your hops for your brewery. So in my mind, if you're at selection, in a lot of ways, you're already a successful brewer, right? You are already succeeding because, generally you've got to be buying a minimum amount of hops to make it worth your while to go there, for the expense, the travel, especially for folks like me coming from out this way, the expense of the travel and everything else. So I usually say, well, you made good enough decisions to actually arrive here at the table. Just back yourself again. You will, sure, you're going to have times where you doubt yourself. And when you have things like appear later on, like they do like smoke taint, well, as Alex was saying before, like that went through, those sorts of things go through multiple layers of the keyhole, and it still got through. Like we've seen a little bit of that here and there as well, but that's beyond what any of us could have done anything about. So you can't take that sort of thing on personally. But I would mostly say that, like, you've made the decision to put these particular hops in your beer, and by and large, making those decisions, those type of decisions you've made already, has proved that you deserve your place at the table. It's your table. And as much as anything, it's what goes on outside the table. It's what are you going to do with those hops when you get them home? Did you remember to choose the right ones? It can be easy to be bedazzled by a hop that you love that's meant to be in a particular beer that is veering off those inherent characteristics why you would select that hop and put it in that beer. Like it can happen. Like it's like, wow, this is an amazing. I had it a few years ago, Simcoes that were smelling like candy and fairy floss and all this sort of stuff, and it was amazing. And it's like, I had to stop myself and go, that's not why I use Simcoe. I've got all these other hops that can fill those places. I need my Simcoe to be back in that piney, like a punch in the face with a fistful of thistles sort of character that I really like, and it's sometimes you just got to keep your head clear and realise, that you got to dial down.
What is the purpose of the hop?
Why do you use that hop in your beer?
What would you suggest to people, Bob?
I think is what we do, and what I find helpful is to externalize the sensory information and sensory data. So it's like, I love that so many of the speakers have talked about sensory, and I think that is so critical. But sometimes it is hard to reflect on that sensory memory, especially when you're rubbing a million different types of hops from a million different farms, and it's like it can all start to blur. So, for us, sometimes I can't trust my own memory. So we try to externalize as much of the information as we can. So, our team, as we're rubbing, or all the hops that we're rubbing, we take notes, but then those notes get logged. And so we have an ongoing log that's year over year separated by varietal, and then from there we can see what, year and farm or whatever, and each way of the process. So it's like whole leaf, pelletized, finished beer. Sometimes it's hard to keep up on that, but we try to as much as possible so that we can see the sort of like track of like, okay, we were there, we rubbed these whole leaf. Did it actually translate into pellet? Did it translate into finished beer? So I would say as much as you can possibly put into externalizing it, writing it down, getting it into a spreadsheet. And, it takes time, but start collecting that data so that then you can start to see trends like, oh, we selected Idaho from Mosaic 5 out of the last 6, or Mosaic from Idaho 5 out of the last 6 times, or, oh, we keep selecting from this farm blindly, or we're noticing this quality and we really like it. And it actually translates from our rubbed flour to our finished beer. So, I look at those sheets pretty frequently as we're just like making beers throughout the year. And so I would say if you can, it's the best way to like have that imprint and have as many people on your team that are there doing the same, and it all goes into one collection spot.
Do you pick single lots for a variety, or do you like to get a number of lots and use them for different things or blend them? What's your approach?
Initially, as I said before, I sort of blended. I can remember the first year blending as much as I could, and I could only had enough volumes for 2 or 3 varieties to actually do that, that were big enough to justify blending, because I was finding my feet and finding my way. And then I moved into like a lot of it were single lots, and then we actually grew out of that. So in a lot of cases, and it's not bragging, it's just life, right? And it's just the way the trajectory that Balter's gone, is that now it's really hard for us, apart from some of the really smaller ones, Laurel and Sabro and some of those things, to actually get a single lot. Like we have to have multiple lots. With our Mosaic last year, I think I looked at 12 lots. And the weird thing was I ended up making blends out of the best 4 of them and different permutations. And then this was a really long selection, by the way. So then I got all the rejects like off the table, and I spent like another probably hour or so selecting blends out of the 4. Like I'd rank them 1 to 4, judge 1 and 2 together, 1 and 3 together, blah, blah, blah. Go through all of that from intensity, high to low, attributes that yes, that's classic Mosaic. This is the Mosaic I really like. That's okay, but it's a little bit too loud or a little bit too soft. How do I play with it? And that was a really, really interesting thing. It's the first time I had to go that far, where the Mosaic, the selection ultimately ended up being a selection of blends more than just, wow, that's the lot. What can I put with it to pad out the volume? Because it just wasn't going to work like that. So, and then it took me into a really interesting place, because I had this super explosive Idaho lot, actually, and it was just blowing my head off when I first smelled it. And then I go back to these other ones, and I had a number 2 pick that was always going to be in it for sure. And then out of these others, they were like lesser intensity, but they had, one of them in particular had a staying power. And number 1 up here, the sexy girl up the front, was really, really explosive. But when I went back to it, it dissipated really, really quickly. And I ended up with the best blend I think I can remember from this was my number 2 rank and my number 4 rank made my number 1 blend. And, all day, like we've, folks talking about how we've got synergies and interplay in different compounds and how aromas, masking effects and amplification effects and all that sort of stuff. And it was just, that was a really cool real-time example of that, that hop, if you had 30 seconds to select it, that number 1, you go, that's it, there. You go back 10 minutes later and you go, oh my God, what have I done? Because it's all disappeared. Whereas this one, not quite as handsome over here, but has, staying power. That'll be the one that gets married.
But what's your, do you pick kind of one lot of a variety, or do you want to have stuff in the cupboard that you can go and pick and choose depending on what you're trying to create?
Kind of a mix of stuff. I would say that we, in general, we don't really pick true to type. We pick best hop on the table. So, we kind of embrace the idea, and I would prefer to be picking individual lots that are stellar, that maybe aren't even representative, because for me, then that makes every growing season fun and unique, and we get to live by that vintage of hop for that year. But to further that, we try to purchase from as many suppliers as we possibly can, so we can sort of see the evolving industry. So it's we have some trusted suppliers, and maybe most of our contracts are with those, but we always keep other suppliers. We have small contracts with other suppliers just so that we can sort of make sure we're kind of keeping tabs on Oregon or Idaho or Washington, and we'll get individual lots from that. And even if they're different, we find ways to that's the fun of the brewing year, is that we have these new individual lots to play with, and we keep them uniquely individual. That's and cool. Think about brewing with individual lots.
I'm really jealous of that. Because at the size that we are, that's the opposite of what we need to do, and because being super consistent, people expect XBA to be XBA to be XBA to be XBA day on day out, and that's the reason that I get to look at a lot of hops and all this sort of stuff comes down for us to that sort of core range of beers that I have to keep on track year after year. It's that classic one where I love the idea of the hops living and breathing and expressing, and because each year I know that, say with, let's just say Mosaic, that I'll get a bit of what I want in that one, but I also need this thing over here that one doesn't have, and I put them together and try and have the one, my ideal Mosaic, that still sits roughly within the guidelines of what our audience would expect from the beer I'm going to put it in. But yeah, that's what I want to do. Just
it's ironic, isn't it?
It is.
You can play more at the bottom. Hey, I've got to ask both of you.
Hey. Fucking hell.
I've got to ask both of you.
4.5 hours in a car the other day.
No.
Just that was an existential chat if ever there was one.
Can I ask you both, do you get attached to a farm? Do you find that you've picked something a number of times, or you've made an emotional connection with a farmer, or you've seen the way they do things? I mean, particularly finding you've picked year on year the same farm, and then have you ever had the experience of actually asking, hey, I want that farm back on the table. I want that field back on the table, because that it's...
I'll start. One, I always want to select blindly, because I just think that it's I'm excited to see things evolve, and I'm excited for sort of new innovations or revelations from new regions. That said, we continually pick certain farms or certain regions. It's I go back to Idaho, we just keep selecting Idaho. Or there's these alluvial farms in Oregon, Coleman, that we've selected over and over and over. So we continually select the same farms, but I personally want to select blind because I want to make sure I'm exposed to as much as possible.
Scotty, because I mean, obviously you're wanting standardization for some of your beers. Obviously you are allowed to play with some of them, but you're wanting standardization. Do you ask for the same farms?
No. I want the merits from that year's hops from wherever they're from to be what makes their way into our beer. And invariably, the cream rises to the top, and the best growers that I deal with, in most cases the hops I end up having in maybe a final selection, and when you go through it and have a look at who they actually were, they're usually the same. They're usually the same suspects most years that they'll be there. But it might be like, well, I selected from, say, Coleman's this year for Mosaic, but last year I had them, but it was Amarillo. And I love that when it jumps around. And the thing is, as you build those, when you get to know the people, because, you know, like, I'm not sure if it's the same for Bob, but for me, when I started selecting and then I started to see year after year the same farms, and, you know, obviously you need to have relationships with these people, because in one way or another, whether it's their location, a combination, their location, their growing philosophies and their practices and their care and diligence and effort somehow aligns to your own, right? And you're all basically making the one thing together. Just sometimes it's 12,000 miles apart or whatever it is. But I think that's really cool when that happens. So every time, you know, when you get the reveal and find out who the farm is, and if it's someone that you've got a great relationship and a friend, like, oh, it's Cheer. I'm always really, really happy. But every single year, there's someone new comes in somewhere. Always. So there's always, again, and that just tells me that I'm not just defaulting somehow subconsciously to a particular generic characteristic every time, or whether it's just a singular terroir thing. I'm looking for the best example of that.
I always find it kind of comforting, though, when I find the same farm reoccurring, because it makes me feel like I'm not randomly just picking whatever suits me on that day. You feel like there actually is a reason for that there is some kind of quality or some characteristic that you love that's coming from that place.
I was just going to say, I think that carries over from the terroir thing, is that it, like, I think we really continue to see that it's like you're picking the same farm blindly because there is something unique to that region and whatnot. So, yeah.
Have you guys ever had a negative experience out of selection? You picked the wrong fucking thing and then you're stuck with it. How do you deal with it? What do you do?
I've had some that just, I guess, have aged quicker, or just evolved over the year, that haven't been held up as well as I'd like. You know, sometimes, I guess, because you're doing that, you're a human being and you're using your snoz, and you don't have, you know, you're not sitting there with the machine that goes ping running analytics to go, oh, that, you know, apart from HSIs, you're going to go, oh, well, that's going to be shit in 6 months' time. How can you predict the smoke thing? Because to me, with smoke, I've seen it mostly in cryo, not in T90 when I've seen it. And it's been when I'm closer to the next harvest than I am to the one that has come from. So it's usually at that sort of 8-9 month period before I've seen stuff like that. But I guess other than that is, like Bob, if you've taken your notes and you're sort of tracking this stuff, you might have seen something that was slightly different. You know, it could be a climate, you know, something to do with the weather, or an agricultural event that's changed the hop, and you did your best as a human. I guess other than that, you'd have to blend it out. You know, I mean, for the most part, like, yeah, I'm usually pretty bang on for what I want, and I know it's very different to what Bob does, but and we have a really, really full-on sort of sensory program at Balter, which is, you know, a lot around finished beer. We taste water. We look at hops when we've got them there. If for us and the size we are, I think there's almost like too much white noise. I create all the beers, so I sort of try and have this singular vision so that we can't deviate, so that the beer doesn't drift too much over time. And I think and it might sound a bit boring, but for us, a huge part of Balter's success over time is that people rely on our beer. And it's their beer. It's almost not my beer anymore. So our job is to make sure we make their beer the way they expect it of us, you know. So
it seems like most suppliers are willing to work with you if you're not happy with the finished product. So that's what it's been in my experience, that it's like we're just not happy with something. Then we can buy something that maybe is in a specific lot, but we can like play the field of other, So I feel like if we're not happy, then usually I think all of our suppliers would work with us to like transition to another lot.
Ours are the same for sure, but like sometimes we might be talking about pallets and pallets of stuff, and you might find that it's only a few boxes. Like, because when you think about in all the bales that are going to go into your hops, and then they've got to be transported halfway across the country, like it might be just a few bales that were shitty, and you have to work your way through them. I have seen hops that have gone, yeah, they're not great, and then they're the exact same hops, and then a month later it's like, no, we're good, it's really good. And then we go on a search, well, was it something we did, So then we tend to blame ourselves as humans more than the hops.
I mean, this is something, obviously there'll be some people in the audience who maybe just don't have access, especially New Zealand brewers who can't get to the States, can't select. One thing that people can do, obviously, is if they get a lot and they don't like it, being quite specific that they didn't like that and asking for another one. Or equally, if you really love the lot you got, saying, hey, when I get more, can I just get that lot? Because I really dug it. It's possible sometimes, not others. Yeah. We're going to wrap it up because everyone's thirsty as hell. And there's some amazing beers. Any last tips or tricks that you reckon you could offer people? Could be super practical. Anything you think around selection that you've learned over the years that you would like to pass on?
I mean, I think that there's like every speaker talked about sensory and sensory driving, and I think like sensory education is like the best thing you can possibly do. It's like I know that I'm not like super technical, but I think I have an approach of a craftsman, and my craft requires me to have good senses. So take a sensory course and have definable terms within your team so that you're speaking the same language and you're specific as to what that sensory is. So that's what I would say, is build your sensory, like, and do it in a finite, like a defined way. Like I took an Araxa course, and that was probably the best week, the most I've learned ever in beer in 1 week, start 5 days time. So yeah. Yeah,
really similar. We drive, the sensory piece at Balter is, really quite developed now. So we do multiple sensory a week. And it's for us, like we've got a vocabulary, like an in-house vocabulary, so that we do all speak the same language. So that's obviously really important. And we sometimes remember that you're a human being, and sometimes that, COVID's brought it on. I've had times where I went to Minneapolis last year, caught COVID with pretty much the whole Australian contingent that went there. And I got home, gave it to my wife. She slapped the shit out of me because she got really sick and I didn't. But one thing that happened was that my sense of smell went missing for 2 or 3 days. Then it came back. Then it was gone for a day. Then everything tasted like shit. Everything was really bitter. I couldn't smell anything sweet. I went up and down and all over the place. But I knew underneath that I'd, as doing this for so long, having that sensory training, I suppose, and that experience and that exposure, I just had to put the cue in the rack from a sensory piece for a week or two and just realise I'm actually cactus right now. I haven't lost the ability to know a good beer from a bad one or a good hop from a bad one. It's just COVID's kicking my ass, or my nose anyway. So, it's like knowing that sometimes. That is one thing I'd say with sensory sometimes, is know when to call it quits. Go outside, sneeze 50 times, have a beer, whatever. You got to remember you're a human, you're an animal. You're not an infallible machine, and you have to make allowances for that. And I do it all the time for me personally with sensory. I know when it's probably a good beer right there in the glass, but I'm not a very good taster right now. And just to recognise that. And then, if the other sensory team members aren't there, then I'll call them in. So can you go and check those 2 beers for me, please? Because quarantining myself from this for a few days, and then you come back.
Any questions? Man, you guys really want a beer, don't you? Shit.
Yes.
All right. Obviously, you can corner either of these two wonderful people and talk to them as much as you like in a second. Thank you both so much. Put your hands together.
Cheers.